Welcome to Fireside Frights. Our first story is, I'm an urban explorer. There's something in the sewer tunnels that the government doesn't want you to know about. Written by Reddit user Deadbowl4572. I'm an urban explorer. Some call it urbex, some call it illegal activity. I just do it for the thrill. I had been looking into an abandoned tunnel in the subway system near my city, leading into the sewer system and deeper labyrinths, so I decided to head over there. It was midday when I threw on my hiking boots, packed bag full of gear and supplies, put on a long-sleeve shirt, jacket, and gloves, and of course, not without my sawed-off shotgun I kept tucked away for easy reach in my backpack. I took the bus to the subway station, looking into the place and the system of tunnels as I arrived. As I made my way into the subway station, the wind picked up, cutting through my jacket before I arrived at the entrance of the tunnels, after walking a mile or two down the empty subway system, and I stepped inside. After leaving the dimly lit subway tunnel, it was pitch black, and I could barely see anything. I began walking forward slowly, testing each step with my foot before moving to the next. After some time had passed, I stood up and continued walking through the tunnel, which oddly had no graffiti or markings. I walked for several minutes where it slowly went downwards. At the end, there was a cavern. I looked up and saw the ceiling was very high above me. The place must have once been part of the subway system's construction, but now it was completely abandoned and forgotten, and leading into some sort of half-man-made cavern. The floor was still concrete, and the walls were cracked and covered in mold and dust. I walked further into the half-built underground system, until I heard movement from the far darkness of the tunnel, and my heart dropped. I could see a group of 5 or 6 creatures running right towards me. They were all wounded and around the size of dogs, and looked straight out of hell. They weren't like any other animal I had ever seen, but physically they resembled some sort of giant salamanders, but with pulsating, vibrating flesh, and faces that looked like a mass of teeth and appendages surrounded by feelers. As soon as I laid eyes upon them, they started crawling towards me like demons. I reached into my backpack, held up my shotgun, and aimed it straight at the nearest monster. I squeezed the trigger, and a loud bang echoed through the entire room as the creature dropped to the ground. But it didn't stop coming. It opened its mouth and let out a shrill cry. I fired again and again, hitting the creature wherever I could. Then I realized, as they crawled past me, that they weren't coming after me. They were running from something. I was breathing heavy and my heart working to take it all in. "Fuck," I whispered. I ran the way I came, finding the ladder and going down as fast as possible, landing on a giant chunk of concrete as I looked around. Both sides looked horrifying, as I heard sounds of concrete being smashed and something enormous coming closer and closer. I couldn't decide fast enough which direction I had come from, so I picked a side and I began running. "Fuck!" I yelled when I had found I had come to a dead end. The only thing in front of me was a solid concrete wall. Then, just as I heard the sounds come closer, I discovered another tunnel going farther into the wall, wide enough I could go in without crouching. I instantly cleared the rubble around it and began running through. As I noticed carvings and blood seeping from the walls, the creatures came closer, bigger and faster this time, crawling in the darkness and letting out roars I will never forget. I stopped running as soon as I saw a ladder, and I held on to the rusty bars of the ladder as I pulled myself up as fast as I could, getting on top of the tunnel and reaching a manhole cover. It was at least 100 pounds, and I could barely budge it open. I started panicking until I used a steel pipe to push through the edge, and I pried the manhole open and slid it to the side. I pulled my body up and dropped my backpack in the process, pushing myself through the hole before I crawled and laid on the busy city street. I took one last look into the sewer tunnel I had crawled out of, and I saw an ancient evil staring right back. If you have a story you'd like me to read, you can email it to firesidefrightschannel@gmail.com. Our next story is I'm Never Camping Again, written by Reddit user chameleonyeet. I sat by the fire and exhaled slowly before taking in the cool night air. The fire danced and crackled along to its natural rhythm, and the hidden army of crickets soon took up their famous chirp. This time used to be my favorite part of camping. Just immersing myself in the calm solitude these mountains never fail to provide while watching dusk fade to night was always the perfect way to end a long day spent in the woods. I was deep in thought when something pulled me quite violently out of my thoughts and filled me with dread. I felt like I was being watched. The crickets had stopped and been replaced by a low, almost musical humming that seemed to come from all around my camp, just outside the firelight. I peered into the inky abyss between the trees illuminated by my fire, attempting in vain to find the source of this noise. I have a history of occasional auditory hallucinations, usually before and after sleep, so I chalked it up to exhaustion and decided to turn in for the night. After kicking out my fire, which was already burning low, the humming seemed to slowly get louder and closer, but I still thought it was only a hallucination at the time, so I ignored it and continued over to my tent. By the time I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, the humming was nearly deafening, so I sat curled up in the fetal position at the bottom of the sleeping bag, with my hands clutched over my ears. The noise was still growing closer, to the point where I felt it more than heard it. The sound of a freight train thundering all around my camp, vibrating the very earth I was laying on. It got closer and closer, louder than I thought possible, and just when I thought surely my eardrums would give out from the pressure and I would be deaf, it stopped. At this point, I was too shaken to move or really do anything. No way I could make it to my car, so I sat there, shaking and crying, eventually drifting off to sleep. When I woke up, the events of the night before were completely off my mind. I lazily started a fire to make breakfast and coffee, and it wasn't until the coffee was halfway brewed and I was absent-mindedly staring into the open flame that the trauma I had experienced the night before slowly started seeping its way back into my thoughts. I sat down next to the fire and contemplated the events of the night before. No hallucination I have ever experienced has ever been louder than a normal speaking voice, and perhaps more importantly, I felt the ground shake with my whole body, and my hallucinations have never been more than auditory. I knew logically that it could not be a simple hallucination, but at the time, I was a strict skeptic, and another explanation eluded me, so I decided to continue my camping trip. Not only that, but I already took the time off work and wouldn't get another chance to come out here for a while, so I desperately didn't want to shorten my already limited time camping. After deciding to ignore the events of the night before, I enjoyed my camping trip like any other. I hiked, fished, and even went for a very cold swim in the nearby lake. My trauma, almost entirely forgotten in the light of day, was easy to ignore without any physical evidence or lasting damage. By the time I made my way back, the shadows had grown long and the sunlight had grown orange, so I immediately started getting a fire going, when a familiar dread crept its way back into my psyche with its accompanying hum. I quickly turned away from my unfinished campfire to scan the tree line for an unseen observer and caught movement in the corner of my eye. But naturally, by the time my head snapped over, there was nothing to see but trees and fading sunlight and the faint sound of humming. Cold terror shot down my spine, and voices that didn't feel like mine filled my head with the words, "Go away!" in a panicked voice. I may have had a history of hallucinations, but this was simply too much. I was going home. I started taking down my tent, hoping to get it cleaned up before the sun left me alone in the dark. But the feeling of dread was growing worse, and the sun was fading faster than I thought it would. I was still struggling to fit everything in the bag with shaking hands when I looked up to watch the last holdouts of sunset fall beneath the horizon and felt a much worse sense of dread settle deep within me. I saw a tall figure creeping towards me through the trees in the post-sunset light. Pale and upright, but too far away to make out details beyond that. The humming noise grew with the approach of the mysterious creature, causing me to freeze in place for a couple of seconds before grabbing for my keys and bolting to my car. But not before noticing the thing take off towards me as soon as I moved for my keys. I was enveloped by the ever-present humming that terrified me the night before, but in the moment it felt only comforting, like an old friend who had my back. I pulled open the door to my car and felt something sharp graze my shoulder as I slid in and slammed the door. I looked out my window, and this thing was running full tilt at my car, but only moving backwards. Something was not only keeping it at bay, but actually pushing back on this white thing that so threatened my life and so injured my shoulder. The buzzing was as loud as it ever had been before. The space in front of the creature was blurry, obstructing my view, but I had no time to contemplate the implications of these facts. I yanked my car into drive and broke every speed limit on the way home. I still don't know what that thing was, but I'm thankful for whatever made that buzzing noise. I think it saved my life. I'm also not too broken up about leaving my camping supplies behind. I'm sticking to the city from now on.